Pope John Paul II made history in 1978 by becoming the first non-Italian pope in more than 400 years. He was a person who had a great influence on the history of the Church and the whole world. In the last moments of his life, when his eyes were heavy, his breathing gradually became weak, and his heart was struggling to beat its last beats, the old father still raised himself to the face of God and announced to the world his last words. What is revealed in his letter could completely change the fate of the entire world. But before he actually passed away from illness in 2005, he was saved from death many times by God. Even the horrifying assassination at St. Peter's Square did not make him fall. Is this the miracle of God's power? Everything related to this pope has surprised the whole world until now. Join us in this video while we're revealing all of secrets. Last messages of the Holy Father. Pope John Paul II's early life was marked by great loss. His mother died when he was 9 years old, and his older brother died when he was 12. The school was closed the next year by Nazi troops during the German occupation of Poland. Wanting to become a priest, John Paul began studying at a secret seminary run by the Archbishop of Krakow. After World War II ended, he finished his religious studies at a Krakow seminary and was ordained in 1946. Then, he became the Bishop of Olmby in 1958 and became the Archbishop of Krakow in 1964. He was made a cardinal by Pope Paul II in 1967, and in 1978 became the first non-Italian pope in more than 400 years. As the leader of the Catholic Church, he traveled the world, visiting more than 100 countries to spread his message of faith and peace. He lived a devoted life until he died in 2005. In his later years, John Paul's health appeared to be failing. At public appearances, he moved slowly and seemed unsteady on his feet. He also visibly trembled at times. On March 27th, Easter Sunday, the pontiff appeared in public for the last time. He struggled to speak to the crowd at St. Peter's Basilica, but his tracheostomy did not allow him to do so. John Paul II ended up merely blessing the pilgrims with a hand gesture and returning inside. Also during this period of poor health, he devoted all his time to dedicating himself to God and writing messages for all humanity. These messages were only revealed after his death. Pope John Paul II died on April 2, 2005, at the age of 84, at his Vatican City residence. More than 3 million people waited in line to say goodbye to their beloved religious leader at St. Peter's Basilica before his funeral on April 8th. Struggling to breathe, Pope John Paul II mumbled his final words weakly in Polish. "Let me go to the house of the Father." 6 hours later, the comatose pontiff died. The account of John Paul's final hours appears in a meticulously detailed official report on his last weeks just released by the Vatican in what might be an effort to ward off any doubts about his illness and April 2nd death. There was much speculation in past decades over how some pontiffs died and what caused the end. John Paul II's brief tenure of 33 days as Pope in 1978 spawned conspiracy theories that he did not die naturally in his bed, as the Vatican said. Some wondered if he had information about a scandal involving the Holy See's bank. While no one has publicly suggested anything amiss about John Paul II's final hours, the Vatican said nothing for years when it was apparent to observers that the globe-trotting pontiff was suffering the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. The report chronicles John Paul II's symptoms, care, and response to treatment during 2 hospitalizations, and then during his last days in his Vatican City apartment. Following the second hospitalization, which included February 24 throat surgery to insert a breathing tube, John Paul's convalescence was hampered by very difficult swallowing, laborious attempts to utter words, nutritional deficit, and marked weakness. The account says, "Swallowing and breathing problems were consequences of the progression of Parkinson's disease, which the 84-year-old Pope suffered from for years," doctors have said. According to a Polish tradition, a small, lit candle illuminated the twilight of the room where the Pope was expiring. In the dying moment of the Pope, a nun who was near the pontiff heard him say, "Let me go to the Lord." At the time of John Paul's death, said he looked toward the apartment window and whispered, "Amen." A Polish priest, as saying the Pope died an instant after he made a great effort to say, "Amen." According to the Vatican account, the Pope uttered his final words at 3:30 p.m. A little before 7 p.m., he went into a coma, and the Vatican press office announced the time of death as 9:37 p.m. A message by Pope John Paul II was read April 2, 2005, the day of his death, at the end of the first funeral mass celebrated for the pontiff. Then Archbishop Leonardo Sandri read the text before the recitation of the Regina Caeli, which during the Easter season replaces the Angelus. The Pope had written, "To all of mankind, who so often seems lost and dominated by the power of evil, egoism, and fear, the risen Lord offers as a gift his love, which pardons, reconciles, and opens the soul again to hope. It is a love that converts hearts and gives peace. How the world needs to understand and welcome divine mercy." In his text, the Pope commented on the Gospel reading in which the risen Christ appears to the apostles and shows them his punctured hands and side. Those glorious wounds that he made an incredulous Thomas touch 8 days later reveal God's mercy, who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He continued, "Lord, who with your death and resurrection revealed the Father's love, we believe in you, and with trust we repeat today, Jesus, I trust in you, have mercy on us and on the entire world." In the last moments of his life, when he turned his heart to God, the Pope never asked for anything for himself, but he prayed for the community, for all his sheep to be filled with God's grace, for them to have enough strength to overcome temptation, because he predicted that Satan would become stronger over time. At the end, when he no longer had the strength to struggle, he just asked God to take him home with him. 4 times God miraculously saved John Paul II from being killed before his time. Before he passed away at the age of 84 after a long period of illness for more than 26 years reigning as the Vicar of Christ, did you know he was nearly killed at least 4 times during his lifetime? Playing with a gun as a teen. The first time is when he was a child. When Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II, was 15 years old, he would often hang out with a friend after school whose family owned a bar. There was a local policeman who sometimes drank at the bar off-duty, and if he felt he was too affected by the alcohol, he would leave his gun in their cash drawer for safekeeping. One day, his friend took the gun out of the drawer, playfully pointed it at Wojtyła, who was just a few feet away, and said, "Hands up or I'll shoot." The gun then mistakenly went off. Even though it was at nearly point-blank range, the bullet amazingly just barely missed Wojtyła. Run over by a Nazi truck in a Polish winter. In February 1944, Wojtyła was walking home from a quarry he worked at when he was run over by a Nazi truck. A woman noticed the body and ran to help him. Though at first they thought he was dead, they quickly discovered instead that Wojtyła was unconscious and badly injured. She and a German officer flagged down a lumber truck driver, who they asked to take him to a nearby hospital. When Wojtyła finally awoke, he was in a hospital covered in bandages. His injuries included a severe concussion, a shoulder injury that would give him a permanent stoop, and numerous cuts. He spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital, recuperating and pondering the peculiar ways of Providence. That he had survived this incident seemed a confirmation of his priestly vocation, writes his biographer George Weigel, shot by an assassin. This is probably one of the church's nightmares, and at the same time, the time when God clearly showed how he protected John Paul II. On May 13, 1981, the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, the pontiff was greeting pilgrims in St. Peter's Square in an open car when Aka fired 4 shots at nearly point-blank range. All 4 bullets hit John Paul II. This guy was quickly caught and restrained, while John Paul II was rushed to the hospital where he received emergency treatment. John Paul II firmly believed Our Lady of Fatima saved his life. A reminder of how the Fatima devotion and the physical safety of the Pope have long been intertwined. For several reasons, the 1981 assassination attempt was a history-making event. It led the Vatican to exponentially expand the protection of the pontiff, including the bulletproof glass that protected the Pope ever since until the election of Pope Francis. John Paul II was convinced that Mary, in the form of Our Lady of Fatima, had personally redirected the bullet that hit him, saving his life. He gave a bullet recovered from the Pope mobile to the local bishop in Fatima, who placed it in the crown of the official image of Mary in the shrine of Fatima, which Pope Francis will venerate. Stabbed by a traditionalist priest. Concerned about post-Vatican II reforms in the church, Spanish priest Fr. Juan María Fernández Crone became radicalized, convinced that communists had infiltrated the church and that John Paul II was himself a communist agent bent on destroying the church. Overcome with the prospect of a communist pontiff subverting the church, Fr. Crone took matters into his own hands and plotted to assassinate John Paul II. The day before the anniversary of John Paul II's first assassination attempt, on May 12, 1981, Fr. Crone broke through a security line at Mass in Fatima, Portugal, with a bayonet, and successfully stabbed the pontiff, who had barely recovered from the first attack, before being subdued by security. John Paul II, however, continued on with Mass like nothing had happened. While checking himself later, though, there was blood. But his wound was small enough that the pontiff decided to simply bandage it up and conceal it. He hid it well enough that it wasn't even publicly known that Fr. Crone had actually successfully stabbed him until 2008, when the pontiff's former secretary told the story in a documentary. These 2 failed attempts against John Paul II weren't the only ones in modern history. The first one took place back in 1970, when Pope Paul VI was attacked with a knife at the airport in Manila, Philippines, shortly after his arrival in the country. As happened with John Paul II's second attack, both Pope Paul VI and the Vatican downplayed the incident, not even acknowledging he had been hurt until after his death. Pope John Paul II's legacy. A vocal advocate for human rights, John Paul often spoke out about suffering in the world. He held strong positions on many topics, including his opposition to capital punishment. A charismatic figure, John Paul used his influence to bring about political change and is credited with the fall of communism in his native Poland. He was not without critics, however. Some have stated that he could be harsh with those who disagreed with him, and that he would not compromise his hard-line stance on certain issues, such as contraception. John Paul II presided over the Catholic Church for 26.5 years, longer than any other pope except St. Peter and Blessed Pius IX. During those 26 years, he visited over 130 countries, published more than 50 major documents, canonized hundreds of saints, and appointed most of the Church's active bishops. We are taught by God that if someone slaps you on your left cheek, give them the other. In theory, yes, but putting it into practice is so impossible. But Saint John Paul II did this. He spoke a message of forgiveness, appeasing the anger of the whole world and bringing comfort to those who had harmed him. Might you remember that fateful day? On 13th of May 1981, the Polish pontiff was passing through the thousands of faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square, blessing the crowds from his open Pope-mobile. Suddenly, 4 shots were fired at close range, and John Paul II collapsed into the arms of his aides as the Popmobile was driven away at speed, chased by a team of security officers. Our saint, who had been hit in the abdomen, left hand and right arm, was rushed to Rome's Gemelli Hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. Panic broke out in St. Peter's Square as the faithful cried and prayed that the Holy Father would survive the shooting. 2 female bystanders were also injured in the attack. The afternoon's dramatic events were reported live by a Vatican radio journalist. For the first time, there is talk of terrorism, even in the Vatican. Any of us, if we were in his situation, would be extremely angry with the assassin and hope that he lives as miserable as possible. That is a very normal psychology. But Pope John Paul II took actions that shocked the whole world. On the Sunday morning after the shooting, the Pope addressed the faithful in a recorded message from his hospital bed, asking people to pray for the man who pulled the trigger, whom he referred to as my brother, and offered his sincere forgiveness. Within a few weeks, John Paul II had recovered fully, and on December 27, 1983, he went to visit his attempted assassin, a man named Acca, in Rome's Rebibbia jail. In June 2000, after serving almost 20 years of a life sentence in prison in Italy, Acca was pardoned by then Italian President Carlo Azeglio Ciampi at the request of John Paul II before being deported to Turkey. But these numbers are only part of the story. Pope John Paul II will go down in history as the most important world leader in the second half of the 20th century. He changed the course of history and helped bring an end to the Cold War through his support of the Polish trade union Solidarity and the Polish freedom movement. This started the landslide that wiped out communism in Eastern Europe and eventually the Soviet Union. He was the right man in the right place at the right time to shape world history. In a world of competing economic and national self-interests, Pope John Paul II was a prophetic voice for humanity and reconciliation. But John Paul's care for the world was not directed only to Eastern Europe. He was a prophet for peace and justice elsewhere as well, especially the Middle East and the Third World. He supported humanitarian intervention but opposed preemptive war. He worried about the impact of economic globalization on the poor in the Third World and urged rich countries like the United States to give more generously to development. In a world of competing economic and national self-interests, he was a prophetic voice for humanity and reconciliation. He admired the American people but was not afraid to challenge government policies that were contrary to moral values, whether these were the Clinton administration's population policies or both Bush administration's wars against Iraq. John Paul will also be remembered for greatly improving relations between Catholics and Jews. Disagreements and controversies will continue, but they will be disputes among brothers and sisters, not adversaries. But John Paul's vision of himself was not as a politician or diplomat, but as a teacher. His writing ran the gamut from poetic musings to scholarly tomes. John Paul will also be remembered for his immensely successful pastoral visits to every corner of the world. People by the millions came out to pray with him and hear him preach. What did they come out to see? A reed shaken by the wind? They came to see a holy man, a man of conviction and principle, a man who cared about them, and a man who had changed the course of history. John Paul II was an unrelenting human rights advocate, and his humane actions also laid the foundation for foreign policies at that time. Pope John Paul II used to say that a human who was created not only has rights, but also obligations to God, to themselves, to their fellow men, to the nation, their country, society, and the whole humanity. He predicted all the attacks on the mere existence of Christianity in the decades to come, much like a prophet, and he professed his faith in God, in humans, the family, and the nation. He also pointed out the amount of criticism he received for protecting of the idea of a family during his pastoral visits to the 5 continents. John Paul II talked about marriage and family more than any other popes. He was mostly criticized for that, but he never hesitated to talk about and defend the teaching of the Church about passing on life and protecting life. That defines family as an alliance of love between man and woman. When talking about issues of medicine and bioethics, the Pope warned, "Life has a dignity that doesn't come from anyone but God. On July 5, 2013, waiving the usual 5-year waiting period after his death, the Vatican announced that the Roman Catholic Church would declare Pope John Paul II a saint, and that the canonization ceremony would likely take place within the next 16 months. The Vatican also stated that Pope John XXIII, who headed the Catholic Church from 1958 until his death in 1963 and convened the Vatican II Council, would also be declared a saint. On September 30, 2013, Pope Francis announced that the canonizations of Pope John Paul II and Pope John XXIII would occur on April 27, 2014. The announcement of Pope John Paul II's canonization came after the Vatican revealed that 2 miracles were attributed to the late Pope. After a dying French nun, Sister Marie Simon-Pierre Normand prayed to Pope John Paul II during her battle with Parkinson's disease, the same illness that killed the Pope. She was cured. The second miracle involved a 50-year-old woman who claimed that she was cured of a brain aneurysm after a photograph of Pope John Paul II spoke to her. The official sainthood ceremony held on April 27, 2014, brought together 4 popes. Pope Francis led the event to elevate Pope John Paul II and Pope John XXIII to sainthood, which was also attended by Francis's predecessor, Emeritus Pope Benedict, a soul in love with God. The fire of God's love, like any big fire, spreads on contact. One tree ignites the next one, and that sets the next ablaze. A tiny spark can set a whole forest alight. That's what a soul in love with God can do and what Jesus is longing for. But those who want to set the world on fire with the love of God may have to fight many battles. All saints have had to struggle against the resistance of those who hate that fire because they hate the light of the gospel. Saints are strong. They are ready for the spiritual battle. God has made saints out of sinners, but never out of wimps. St. John Paul II, whose feast day we celebrate on October 22nd, is a good example of this. The Nazi occupation forces closed his university, and young Karl had to work in a quarry and in the Solvay chemical factory for 5 years. During that time, aware of his call to the priesthood, he began courses in the clandestine seminary of Krakow. When he became a priest, the communists spied on him. At the age of 60, an assassin shot him, and he nearly died. As an old man, he suffered from an intestinal tumor, a femur fracture, and the debilitating Parkinson's disease that rendered him immobile, distorted his physical appearance, and finally took away his ability to speak. It doesn't look like the story of a powerful man. However, he changed the world with the fire of the love of God that he had in his heart. St. John Paul II inspired many countries in Eastern Europe to turn away from communism. His zeal for the gospel took him on apostolic trips all over the world. Neither illnesses, Nazis, communists, nor bullets could stop that flame because it's a divine fire. Saints are not wimps. Mary, Queen of all saints, help us to be strong and reliable so that we can serve your Son to spread this divine fire. During his life and papacy, St. John Paul II often spoke against the problems of secular culture. Many of these exist in our world today, which makes his wisdom on various topics so timeless. The world tells us that love can be confined to a greeting card or box of chocolates. Or worse, that love is a fickle feeling rather than a virtuous decision. As Christians, we are called to love beyond a secular standard and to love like Christ, like what St. John Paul II teaches. What really matters in life is that we are loved by Christ and that we love Him in return. In comparison to the love of Jesus, everything else is secondary, and without the love of Jesus, everything is useless. A man of prayer, closeness, justice. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we can see a man sent by God, prepared by Him, and made bishop and pope to guide God's church. There are 3 particular traits that mark the life of John Paul II: prayer, closeness, and mercy. Despite his many duties as pope, John Paul II always found time to pray. St. John Paul II was also close to the people, not detached or separated from them, but traveling the whole world to seek them out. Already in the Old Testament, we can see how God was uniquely close to his people. This closeness culminated in the Incarnation, when Jesus himself dwelt among his people. John Paul followed the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, drawing near to both the great and the small, to those close by and those physically far away. St. John Paul II was remarkable for his love of justice. But his love for justice was a desire for justice completed by mercy, and so John Paul was also a man of mercy, because justice and mercy go together. John Paul, who did so much to promote the Divine Mercy devotion, believed that God's justice had this face of mercy, this attitude of mercy. John Paul II died carrying a heavy cross. He carried it with dignity, but he also carried it according to the principles of Catholic bioethics, refusing disproportionate means when his time to go to the house of the Father had clearly arrived. Remember, John Paul II was a good shepherd to us all, as are all men of Christ. It is up to those remaining to pick up the torch and carry it farther down the road of Christ.